And as I mentioned, this is the Pathways series, and what we're going to be looking at today is accommodations and students with disabilities. One of the things that we talked about as presenters before we jumped in was just this idea of, do we want to do an overview of some of the disability accommodations in a college setting? Do we want to talk a little bit more about interactions with the behavioral intervention team and why these are important? And we kind of landed on yes. So I am very happy to have both Dr. Fitch and Jean with us today, both who work in higher ed, and I'll have them tell you about themselves, and we'll kind of jump in from here. So my name is Brian. I think many of you know me. I'm the director of their behavior and threat management at DPREP, and we're over at the Maxient conference today. So that's why you might see MaxFest logging on. Stepped away from our table for just a moment to come over here with Poppy and Jean. So Jean, do you mind going first, and then we'll have Poppy intro?
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name's Jean Clifton. I'm a licensed high school teacher with master's degrees in teaching in English, but for most of the last decade, I've worked at the university level doing reading and study skills supports as part of the federal TRIO program. More than half of the students that I work with day to day have some form of disability or neurological difference. And as an autistic mobility aid user, I'm often the first openly disabled educator that they've met. I'm really happy to be here. Love sharing my perspective to folks as someone with experience both on the professional side of things and being the person dealing with microaggressions, biases, and inaccessibility. I'll turn it over to Poppy.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks so much, Jean. Hello, folks. My name is Poppy Fitch. Professionally, I'm Dean of Wellness and Disability Support Programs and Services at the San Diego Community College District in San Diego, California. I have been serving students with disabilities for about 30 years. I started as a V1 student worker in a disability support office at the community college where I attended in the 90s, and throughout my higher ed career have maintained some either direct service to students with disabilities as a counselor, direct service as a program coordinator, and at various times I've overseen student affairs divisions where disability support services report up through me. So I have a long history professionally in that realm. And like Jean, I am a person with disabilities, non-visible disabilities, and have taken over about the course of the last decade to sharing more openly about those disabilities, both professionally and personally, for the very same reason that Jean identified, which is often students who are seeking support services do not have anyone in their realm who they know is experiencing a disability such as theirs. One other thing I'll share professionally, personally, is that I am a former foster youth. So I aged out of the foster care system in San Diego in the late 80s. And that part of who I am and its influence, I think, on my trajectory and my career has been really integral. So I always like to share that part of my identity as I'm presenting. So for today, we'll talk, and I just would say we're scratching the surface here, as I know you all are aware. We'll talk just a little bit about students with disabilities in higher education. Brian will kind of tap in terms of the intersection of students with disabilities and bit and care team interactions. Dina's going to dial in a bit more on autism specifically, because we know this is an area where bit team members may really benefit from a deeper understanding. We'll close out with some discussion and Q&A. So I love an interactive Zoom. I know it's hard, but maybe I'll just look for some reactions, thumbs up, or otherwise in the Zoom realm. So with that, I want first to acknowledge that all of you are coming from lots of different places, and I didn't see a single California Community College representative on this Zoom. So I ask that you bear with me for a moment. The presentation of this data is only to contextualize the conversation. So in the California Community College system, there are 116 colleges and about 2 million students. Of those 2 million students, about 100,000 of them, or about 5%, use our disability support programs and services, are referred to as DSPS, so forgive me for that acronym. But The Post-Secondary National Policy Institute tells us that about 19% of college students have a disability. So we have a disconnect. And we know that it's really important for us to understand students with disabilities, not as a monolith and not only through the lens of those students who receive DSPS services, but more broadly to understand that there are students with disabilities all throughout our campuses who may or may not have identified as having a disability. And I think that's an important grounding point for today's conversation. I also want to make a note, the image on this screen is used with permission. The photographer is Chanda Krasinger, and it's taken from the Disabled and Here project. And I wanted to give all of you a little gift today. So I just linked to Disabled in Here. After today's webinar, I hope you'll take a look at it and begin to utilize images of individuals with disabilities in your work, because representation is one of the things we know as a barrier that students experience. So the first thing I want to ask y'all to do is engage in a thought experiment with me. I think we often go straight to what are the barriers or what are the difficulties facing students or people with disabilities. And I want to invite you to instead think about the students that you've worked with, and in the chat, if you would, type in a couple, 2 or 3 strengths or unique qualities that you've experienced in your work with students with disabilities. And I'm not uncomfortable with long, uncomfortable silences, so I'm going to wait until you all do that. As we wait, I'll share from my own experience, advocates and persistence. Pawan, thank you so much. Yes. And a quick type or 2, thank you. As you're sharing, I'll just say one of the things that I've observed in students and people with disabilities is a high degree of empathy, right? I've walked a walk that, or not, that others have not. And as a result, I have a higher degree of empathy for the experiences of other people, whether with disability or without. See the world in a unique way. Attentive, Dana, yeah. I see Adriza's notes, perseverance. I love perseverance. Victoria says fortitude. I like tenacity, the notion that I'm going to keep on doing the thing until it gets done. And I agree with all of you in your observations here in the chat. Thank you so much. One that doesn't often come up, although D Jones 10, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, says also, as I have, creativity and finding strategies to overcome barriers. And you see my final bullet point there, creativity and problem solving. Yes, yes, and yes. And thank you all so much for kind of joining me in grounding for that part of this conversation. Now we are going to talk about barriers faced by disabled students. And I want to make a note that I'm using both person first and identity language here, and I'm doing so intentionally. There are lots of individuals with disabilities who communicate that disability is part of their identity. And as a result, they don't prefer person first language, which is student with a disability is person first. Rather, they prefer identity first or disabled student, autistic student, deaf student. So important for us to dial into the fact that language around disability is not a universal, and it's really important for us to pay attention to how individuals describe themselves and how they want to be described. So I'm just going to go over very quickly some barrier issues, and I'm going to do so through the lens of K-12 schools. I don't know, folks who are here, Brian, you can give me a hint on this if there are many K-12 folks in the room or if it's mostly college, but we'll look at barriers in K-12, not too many. We'll look at barriers in transition, and then we'll look at barriers in college or university spaces. So the very first thing to note of K-12 schools is that there are a vast number of students who have either unidentified or unmet disability-related learning challenges, and that is absolutely true. I can say from my own experience that I did not have a pretty significant learning disability identified until I was in college. So I think it's important for us to root ourselves in the notion that there may be young students in particular, transitioning students, who do have learning challenges but have no history of support services. And that's crucial for us to understand as higher educators. The second element or barrier in K-12 is a lack of participation in IEP processes. So even when students have been identified and do have IEPs, they're often not included in those IEP meetings. So they don't really know how to have a conversation about their learning needs. And then finally, and I think this final item carries through across to transition and college. I know this is true in my experience with students, is disability stigma. The notion that we as a culture look differently on folks who have disabilities. Jean mentioned the word microaggressions, lack of accessibility, faculty members who don't believe that the accommodation that's been authorized is valid. So there's a whole stigma around disability that we will not be able to get into today, but I think important to pay attention to as we go through. So then in terms of the K-12 to college transition, I just want to make a note here that transition services are mandated under the IDEA. So students who are coming to your colleges from K-12 have a right to receive transition supports that help them integrate into college environments, but they're often woefully underdeveloped if they exist at all. And that's just a reality that's true. And one that we need to be prepared for as we receive students into our college and university environments. Certainly, because students haven't been included in their IEP process in high school and earlier, they're navigating unfamiliar administrative processes. They don't know how to engage with colleges or university disability support offices. The differences, understanding the differences between what is a right in a K-12 context and what is an access focus in college or universities. So students under the law no longer are mandated to benefit from education. They need only to access it. And that's a nuanced difference that's often very difficult for students as they're transitioning. And then finally, I'll just add, in my own experience, barriers in colleges and universities, talking about stigma again, talking about very overly rigid accommodation processes that don't take the individual into account. And Jean mentioned it, and I'll put a fine point on it, lack of overall accessibility of the environment. And I'm going to take a deep pause, and I'm just going to look to you, Brian or Jean, if there's anything that you would add to this discussion of barriers.
I think a lot of times it's the assumptions that, well, we have a system set up, so therefore everything is going to be fine. We have automatic door openers. Well, yeah, but do they work? A lot of times on my campus, they don't. So are we actually making sure that, yeah, there is an elevator, but is it maintained? Does it actually function? Are we giving instructions? I have a lot of students who, just getting lost and wandering around campus. If even just as simple as, oh, everyone defaults to giving instructions that go through the stairs, and not everyone's comfortable disclosing that maybe they have an invisible disability and they can't take stairs. There's a lot of things like that that we just wouldn't normally think about. And so really being aware that it's more than just, well, do we theoretically have an infrastructure, but are we actually putting, is it actually useful? And are we highlighting that to everyone who might possibly need it instead of just the people that we are really sure because we see a wheelchair?
Yeah, Jean, you're raising this notion of invisible or non-apparent disabilities and visible or apparent disabilities, and all of what's underneath those. Certainly our ideas about disability root themselves in what can be seen. I think that's an important point that you make.
Yeah, I liked what you're saying, Jean, and I think for this program too, it makes sense to lean into the experts on this. I'm going to try to keep my comment pretty limited. One of the things that comes to mind, and I know we've had these conversations before, Jean, is and with Poppy, just the challenges of individualism within collective of shared experience. That's a fancy way of saying not everyone wants to be called the same thing. Poppy, I loved your, not a surprise that it's coming from California, because I think they've been on the vanguard of a lot of this language and processes. What a cool website. I pulled that up and this is great, because doing instructional design, I can tell you that they're not only people or individuals with disabilities, but different ethnicities, races, experiences. A lot of it is the white people. And it's hard to find images that show diversity. So to watch a project like this, what a very cool thing. And I will be in touch with them because I think I want to help get their message out even more. But more to the point, maybe, and this can be a question for Jean, just people have different opinions. I mean, it seems like a basic concept, right? That not everyone with a disability wants to be referred to or treated exactly the same way. So it requires some empathy and understanding and listening probably even more to individuals' preferences, and realizing that when you know one individual's preference, that's not everyone's preference. Does that track at all, Jean, with your experience?
Completely. It's something I had a whole bunch of notes on, actually. It's great we're getting it here. It's very common to have different people with very different preferences, but honestly, this comes back to exactly what you're saying, listening and being respectful and giving agency to people, and if that's from what's their nickname, what are their pronouns, how do they identify, it's just basic common decency to try to be flexible and interact with people the way that's comfortable for them. And again, especially when it comes to this, the whole, we say, especially in the autistic community, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And I see it a lot with, we have very limited accommodations that we can often provide. And so someone throws out a keyword like autism or ADHD, and someone wants to be helpful, and so they're like, oh well, I worked with this other student, these are their accommodations, you must need the same thing. But often it could be a completely different set of needs and barriers depending on what this individual, the barriers that they're facing, the way that their disability is impacting their lives, and even just the way a course might be set up might dramatically change what accommodations are required. So that listening, I think, is so key.
Brian, I think I'll hand over to you.
I will keep this short and sweet. The impact in the academic space is well known, and we'll kind of pass back to Poppy and Jean to maybe share some personal or experiences even more with students they've worked with. But this is across the board. Find this in the emotional space, the academic challenges, even just requesting accommodations can be difficult. I've often talked with students about it as a pass that they can have and that they can then choose to use in individual classes. And if they're new to that, they're surprised, because in other spaces, especially K through 12, I think it's applied a little more broadly, within an IEP situation. Certainly there's some specifics, but in the college space, I think having students understand that this is something that is a process that they can go through. We like to see that application process into the disability or the service office around these areas to be one that tries to reduce that stigma, making it easier for students, getting that process started in the event that you need it, and not feeling like you need it in every single class. You might, but that's really your choice. Yeah. Jean, I know, again, we've had these conversations with the students you work with at Salem University. Just can you talk a bit about the shift between, it doesn't have to be every class, or it can be certain classes where the disability or the struggle might be more pronounced? What's your experience with that?
Oh, completely. I have a student I was working with last semester where one classroom was just very loud, very overstimulating. It was a big class. And so they wanted to get that quiet testing option, and it worked really well from them. But they felt really weird about it because they're a junior and they've never needed it before. And so they were feeling that they had to deal with a lot of this internalized ableism around, I should be able to do this if I haven't needed it in the past. Am I being lazy? And it didn't help that the professor made some not particularly supportive comments implying that the student wasn't showing sufficient grit. And that really made it a lot harder for them to accept that, no, this is a very reasonable accommodation for the types of neurological differences that they possess. I also think it's important. I loved all of the different examples that were thrown out for the good things. I always loved this, looking at models of disability not as a deficit. And so that was a great thing to start us off. But the fact that so many people immediately start thinking of, oh, you have to have creativity, you have to have resilience and that problem solving. Why? And the reason is because the world is set up in such a hostile way to people with disabilities that they're forced to be able to do that. And not everyone is able to, especially with someone who has a neurological condition that maybe makes it even more of a challenge. Those people often get left behind because of these extra barriers that are put into place, even just to be able to access accommodations. So I think it's always good for us to keep in mind whatever we can do to make it easier and safer and more welcoming for students to get what they need to succeed, so that they can have an experience more like what the abled student gets just automatically. That's the better.
I was thinking about how we learn about these things too, our experience, and it's talking to people and understanding, but there's also the popular media, which is, it's a two-edged sword, I suppose, or double-edged coin. I don't know. It's two parts, one good, one bad. And, I think about shows like Community or the one with the doctor that's on now, that as folks, especially with like ASD or Asperger's, are portrayed on TV, there's on one hand, it's good because it's helping people understand. On the other hand, almost going back to like Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man, I'm really dating myself here, that it gives a very narrow view of one form. To your point, Jean, earlier about you've met one person with autism, you've met one person.
Well, and on TV shows, you're not meeting anyone with autism because they rarely have autistic writers or autistic actors. So you're meeting someone's perception of autism.
Right. And on one hand, it's nice that they're at least including it and trying. On the other hand, when it doesn't include the people who are directly impacted, again, looking at the full variety of things, what's done for entertainment is different than what's done for education. I also think, Poppy, maybe this is back to you again, and we can go on to the bit slide next, but just the issue of faculty, and I don't know why I'm drawn to asking you this question, Poppy, but I feel like you've had interactions with them. Jean brings up the point that, at least the point I was hearing, at least at some point, do faculty kind of, they're hesitant, right? They rebuff, or they're a little, I don't know about that, or not in my class, or this isn't an accommodation. That navigation with the power differential, quite frankly, that's present. Here's someone who's giving the grade and is a power position, privileged position, making some of these decisions. A lot of the work that the disability coordinators and all of their glory do is really fighting, I think, with some of those faculty around these expectations. I know that's been some of your work.
Yeah, I know that that's true, Brian, and I'm sure the folks who are with us today have had similar types of experiences. I know that that's true, and I know, like everything else, there's a real spectrum. So I also want to honor the faculty who are coming to the sessions, embracing the creativity to create contexts that are universally designed, that welcome all students' experiences. And it's true that there remains this stigma. It's true that there remains this kind of sense of, it doesn't seem justifiable to me, or it's not apparent to me why you need this, and therefore I don't want to do it. Or my favorite, it denigrates the overall validity of the curriculum, or somehow changes the ability of the individual student to operate or produce at the same level of other students. We've all seen this image of the kiddos at the fence watching the baseball game, right? And you've got the shorter kiddo or the wheelchair using kiddo who can't see over the fence. And there's a box at the next one, and then there's no fence, or it's chain link or something so they can see through. And this notion of what is equal is not the same as what is equitable. And I think understanding that nuanced conversation is really important as we think about faculty and other colleagues who are not yet on board with what students need. I think it's important for us as educators also to be aware of the psychological, emotional impact of carrying this extra weight. And Jean, you kind of alluded to this earlier, and I do think it's important to put a fine point on. We won't talk about spoon theory today. I'm sure that, Jean, you can do a whole spoon theory session for us at some future point, but I encourage folks, if you're not familiar with this concept of spoon theory, to look it up. The idea is that individuals with disabilities are carrying a heavier weight, and as a result, it makes it more difficult for them to simply get through the day and do the thing. So it's almost like a tax on students with disabilities having to do more than every other student, even while fielding these comments from faculty members that somehow they're doing less. And so it really is kind of sets the student up to, whatever the nature of their disability, have greater experiences around the need for mental health supports, because they have this additional tax that they're carrying.
Yeah, I mean, for the bid work, I think it has to be something that we're paying attention to, that about 70 to 80% of the cases we see in the bit care space are students who have mental illness or challenges in that space, understanding accommodations and how we can make that process easier for students to access accommodations, understanding that some are hidden, some are visible, and seeing that as the happy Sisyphean task of pushing that rock up the hill, that we are always learning more about it. Maybe some of you, like myself, the person first versus identity first language is something that's new. Certainly I understand the concept. I don't know that I've heard that language used as freely. And I have the same reaction I do to homeless to unhoused. Like there's intentionality in language. And I think that helps us better understand and capture what we're talking about. So seeing this as part of the bit work, helping students become successful and overcome obstacles is clearly a big part of this too. And I think that takes us over to Jean.
Thank you so much. So autism is a very large topic with a lot of different pieces and so many misunderstandings. And like we were saying before, so much of people's awareness of autism comes from not autistic people. So this is going to be very short and a very brief overview, but if you're interested in more, a lot of these concepts, if you check out, I have a podcast, Actually Autistic Educator, it's on Apple, Spotify and whatnot, and it goes into a lot of these in greater detail, or you can ask afterwards and you can jump in more. But talking a little bit about autism and neurodivergence or neurodiversity, if you haven't heard about it before, it was originally coming through in the 90s from an autistic sociologist, Judy Singer, who popularized it. But it's this framework about thinking about neurological differences as a difference rather than assuming that anything different is a deficit, is something that's bad and needs to be fixed. Originally created to apply to autism, but it's also commonly used by the ADHD community, which we have a big overlap with autism, and others not considered neurologically typical in different way. Going back to what Brian was saying, why does this language matter? Well, because people's understandings of how do you view people, again, that homeless versus unhoused, what are the assumptions that you're making? What are the cues that language is providing? So when we view autism and we look at language using this neurodiversity lens, instead of focusing on the disorder or deficit style, it encourages us to think of a wider variety of solutions and accommodations that could improve a student's success. Classic one that I always use is what's going to be more helpful for someone who is left-handed, telling them and giving them lots of practice to write with their right hand, or making sure we actually have enough lefty desks and lefty scissors that they're actually supported. If we view things as, this is fine, your autism is a difference, but we're going to accommodate that, it can really shift our perspective. Unfortunately, when we use language like autism epidemic, well, what is that going to make autistic feel about themselves? What's that going to make you subconsciously think about an autistic person when you meet them, when you hear words like that? I have 2 graduate degrees, but literally as soon as I disclosed that I'm autistic, I have had a doctor ask where my guardian was, which was fun. I had another one who refused to give me, who wanted to stop giving me access to reproductive health care on the grounds that autistic people are incapable of consenting to sex, which again, this was full medical doctor. That was fun. I've actually had to ask them to Google the DSM and look something up together before over a couple of these, which has been exciting times. And it's not just that. When I was in my educational program, I actually had a fellow student planning to be a teacher saying that it wasn't fair that autistics were allowed to be out in public because of how creepy and dangerous they could be. And so these are the types of things that people, really impact both an autistic person's comfort in disclosing their sense of self, and also impacts non-autistics. What are the assumptions that we make when this is the language and these are the stereotypes that we see and we're exposed to? How does that color, even subconsciously, our interactions with autistic or potentially autistic students? Also, to be clear, the assumption of incompetence isn't just limited to autism. I've literally lost count of the number of times people have tried this because I'm using my wheelchair. The folks coming over and going, "Where is your aid?" in a very condescending voice is always fun. And a couple of times I had museum guards straight up insist that they couldn't let me leave the building until I had my accompanying person, just because this idea that disability equals incompetent is so rampant in our society. And again, this also ties to what Poppy was saying about that identity first language. I'm autistic. I'm not a person with autism. I don't call myself a person with femaleness or a person with queerness. If someone can only see me as a person when I separate myself from my autism, that's a problem of this bias against autism. We need to remove the stigma and the assumptions we're making, not just use a euphemism to get away from the word. But again, different communities see that very differently. So autistic community as a whole tends to prefer that from most surveys. But if an individual, autistic that I know of prefers to say, oh, I am a person with autism, I'm always going to respect that. That being said, some words we do kind of maybe want to distance from. Hans Asperger was the person that Asperger's was named for. Well, we've more recently realized that his work in figuring out, oh, these children still have some use to society, we're going to split them from the autistics and not consider them the same, was because he was figuring out which children should be sent to the Nazi euthanasia clinic. So he was a Nazi and killed autistic children. So there's been a very big pushback against using that term since that information has come to light. Again, not everyone's comfortable with the change. There's a lot of things, but it on average has fallen out of favor. And I would encourage people to look more into that before defaulting to that term. Also, in general, anytime we try to separate autistics into this, well, who are the ones we can deny agency to? Who are the ones who we can just safely ignore their wants and wishes? And we want a label to be able to do that. The answer is none. All of them, all people deserve agency, and we should be figuring out how best to accommodate them and their individual needs rather than figuring out, oh, well, but not those people don't count. Likewise, I can't really get into it in much detail. Just a quick note, autism as a spectrum means there's a lot of different elements that comprise autism, and some person might have a lot of sensory struggles, but fewer communication struggles. Someone else might be the other way around. It's not a single dial that goes from less autistic to more autistic. And if you look into that, there's quite a lot of great things done by autistics, giving more specific examples. But when we think about for accommodations, one autistic might genuinely need quiet testing because sensory issues, we can often hear, I hear everything. It's very frustrating sometimes. But another student might be completely fine with the noise, but one of my students really struggles and ended up, we got a note taker for them as an accommodation because one professor did all of their lessons through personal anecdotes and relating everything to their personal emotional state, which just would not click for the student. They could do most things, but couldn't do that. So that flexibility in figuring out that individual autistic's needs can be very different from person to person. So again, because autism can present in very different ways, it's very easy to say, hey, don't be biased against autistics, but it's a lot harder to notice how that could be slipping into our practices. Again, people might not feel comfortable disclosing. You never know if the person you're talking to is going to suddenly decide you no longer count as a person. It's a real issue. And also access to diagnosis for both women and for communities of color is dramatically lower due to a variety of things, including a lot of biases in the original research. I had a coworker who went on a huge rant about a student of mine, and she was talking about how he was so disrespectful she refused to work with him because when he came in asking for help registering, he looked down the whole time, he didn't make eye contact. Nothing else, that was it. So when I pointed out that he was autistic and eye contact can be a lot harder and more complicated for us, and two, he also was a very large Black man who shared with me repeatedly that he had dealt with a lot of issues around looking aggressive when he tried to make eye contact. And so he feared for his safety and tended to default away from that. But she insisted, my coworker at the point insisted that, well, he should have told her that he was autistic if he didn't want to be judged for that sort of behavior. And so it's really important to look at, do you actually need someone to do a certain thing? Do you need someone to make eye contact while answering questions about registration? Or is that just what makes you comfortable? Are you viewing something as disrespect and acting emotionally as opposed to thinking about what might their reasoning be and focusing on the goal? Does a camera always have to be on in Zoom, or is that just the default? My students with Tourette's, with various tics, and with autism have dealt with a lot of issues around looking weird while on camera, and it makes them really uncomfortable. The trouble with being accommodating to people who are different means we have to dramatically reframe the assumptions we make about people, their capabilities, and their comfort level. Likewise, to the second point about disability competency, it's really important in specifically when we're thinking, of like if someone is being viewed as a threat or if they were a potential victim. This can really cause a lot of issues. My autistic sibling was stalked by a person more than 20 years older than her. She was 20 at the time, and turned him down romantically, and it escalated after a series of things to breaking and entering, and was very, very upsetting. We called the cops, but both of us were really terrified. I'm doing a lot of masking today. I do usually. I have a whole thing where I put on different facial features and vary my intonation. When we felt scared and threatened, both of us went to flat affect because we were terrified. We forgot to keep up that masking that we do. And the officer said that my sister clearly wasn't upset and didn't look threatened, so they refused to move forward or anything, because if she didn't care, why should they? And when autistic emotions can look very, very different, that can cause people's very real and concerning threats to be invalidated. Likewise, looking different can be seen as aggression, as a threat. Autistics often ask questions because our brains process information differently, but people interpret asking a genuine question as a mark of disrespect. So much of this also applies to other disabilities and differences, assumptions about mobility. My students with ADHD constantly are dealing with people accusing them of being disrespectful for fidgeting. It's really important that we look at what assumptions are we making, often on autopilot, with our interactions with others, for us to actually be able to really improve our accessibility and our interactions and go beyond just have the accessible doors. Okay, it's a little longer than I hoped, but I tried to get it all in there.
Great.
I just want to kind of spotlight everything that you said, but in particular, I think that last example of interaction that was traumatic and then was a precipitating factor for a lack of masking is a really good real life example of how we can be person-centered and trauma-informed. So understanding that a particular interaction or experience is likely to bring about a reaction or lack of reaction from a student or colleague or employee that doesn't match with how we think they ought to be reacting. That's what it means to be culturally competent, or at least to have some humility about our understanding or lack of understanding of disability. Of course, those concepts extend beyond disability identity, but in the context of our conversation today, that's what I think. I mean, if nothing else, people walk away with this idea that how a person reacts potentially in an interaction, a bit related interaction, may or may not look like how you think they should. And there's lots of reasons for that, other than they did the thing wrong, they're guilty, they're up to something. And I really just feel like, Jean, your example was spot on. So thank you for setting me up so well as we close. A couple more thoughts. Understanding, I think in a bit care context, we often have DSPS or disability staff who represent on the bit. And they're often looked to for their expertise, and that's a wonderful and important thing. And it's the role of every behavioral intervention team member, every care team member, to have some measure of competence related to, or even to know the questions to ask as it relates to working with students who have identified disabilities or who may have disabilities that are not identified. So I think just hitting home today that that's a really important element of our responsibility as team members. Of course, I want to leave y'all with just a couple of really key concepts, which are universally designed environments are those that welcome all people of all abilities to the best of our ability. And that's what we should be striving for. Accessibility means that any individual, irrespective of their disability, is able to access the same service or educational experience. And accommodation is the bridge that we use when an environment isn't accessible and isn't universally designed. And that bridge usually comes out of the disability support office, but it doesn't always have to. And I think with that, Ryan, I'm just going to hand it over to you to kind of lead us through Q&A.
Yeah, I was just struck by the beauty of that word image in my head of that around accommodations being the bridge that sort of is put in place to overcome. It's a really cool way to say that. Similar comments to Jean, just your stories were powerful and important and just have, unless, I just want to highlight this, the huge ramifications and contextually looking at interviewing, a threat, at Title IX, and we kind of come back with this idea that we want to avoid assumptions, but have hypotheses. And the hypotheses should be tested with data. They should be related to questions and experience. And we, more than anything, as a good, I'm going to use the word scientist here, should be able to be wrong and listen differently and adjust based on those conversations. And I think that's where a lot of the growth comes. So we'll stop the recording here and give y'all a chance to ask some questions. Let me just go ahead and do that.